Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sarah Stephanie, and thank you for being here. Today, I wanted to share something deeply personal. It's a story I've hesitated to tell because it's not easy, and it doesn't paint me in the best light. But I felt it was important. It's about reaching a certain age, that mid-50s mark, looking at the life you've built over decades. The solid marriage, the accomplished husband, the wonderful son launched into his own life, the beautiful, comfortable home here in the Boston suburbs, and having to confront a difficult truth bubbling up from within. It's a story about choices, about a profound mistake made in a moment of vulnerability, and about navigating the messy, painful consequences that followed. You know, people often talk about achieving the dream, ticking all the boxes. And from the outside, I absolutely had. But what happens when that dream life starts to feel hollow? When the picture-perfect stability you worked so hard for begins to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated cage? That's really where this story begins, in that unsettling quiet, that creeping realization. It's complicated, as life often is. But first, if you find value in stories about real life, messy choices, and figuring things out the hard way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It honestly helps more than you know. So, the setup. Picture it. 28 years of marriage to David, a man I genuinely admired, still do, in many ways. He's methodical, brilliant in his field, respected, predictable, yes, but predictability felt like safety for so long. It was the bedrock. Our conversations had settled into a comfortable rhythm, mostly logistics, coordinating schedules, discussing Joshua's latest achievements, planning necessary house maintenance, deciding which social obligations we couldn't politely decline this month. The passion, the spark. It hadn't died violently. It had just faded. Like a watercolor left too long in the sun, the vibrant hues softening into muted tones, pleasant enough, but lacking intensity. Was it his fault? Mine? Was it just time? The inevitable entropy of long-term relationships? I'd ask myself these questions sometimes, late at night, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight painting patterns on the antique rug. David would be sleeping soundly beside me, his breathing even, oblivious. And I'd feel this profound sense of loneliness, not just being alone, but lonely within the marriage. Lonely within the life that looked so full from the curb. Our son Joshua, he was always the bright star. We poured so much into him, celebrated every milestone. His graduation from college, landing that great job, moving into his own place in Somerville. Each step forward for him felt like a small step back for me, into a space I hadn't quite prepared for. The purpose that had driven me for 2 decades. Raising him, supporting David's career, managing our intricate social calendar, felt diminished. The house, once bustling with Joshua's friends, projects, noise, suddenly felt vast. My volunteer work, the committees, the luncheons, they filled the hours, yes. They looked good on paper. But did they fill me? Increasingly, the answer felt like a quiet, insistent no. I'd walk through the public garden on a bright October afternoon, watching the swan boats glide, families laughing, couples holding hands, and feel like a ghost haunting someone else's perfect day. The chai, elegance of Newbury Street, the intellectual buzz around Harvard Square when I met David for a rare weekday lunch. It all felt like a stage set, beautiful, but unreal. And I was an actress who'd forgotten her lines, unsure of her motivation. There was this restlessness, a yearning for something I couldn't even name. Was it validation, excitement, a feeling of being truly seen, not just as David's wife or Joshua's mother, but as Sarah Stephanie? The woman I vaguely remembered being before the roles took over? It manifested as a low-grade hum beneath the surface of polite smiles and perfectly executed dinner parties, a quiet ache behind the eyes as I listened to friends discuss European travel plans or second home renovations, conversations that felt increasingly distant from my own internal landscape. David, bless him, wasn't attuned to it. He saw the surface, the smooth running of the household, the successful events I organized, the calm exterior I projected. He assumed, I think, that my contentment mirrored his own. Why wouldn't it? We had everything we were supposed to want. The mortgage was manageable, retirement accounts healthy, the neighborhood safe and prestigious. By every external metric, life was good, very good. But inside, tiny cracks were starting to appear in the foundation. Hairline fractures, almost invisible. But I could feel them. And I had this growing, terrifying feeling that I didn't know how to stop them from spreading. Or maybe, even more terrifying, a part of me didn't want to. It started, as these things sometimes do, innocuously, almost ridiculously so. There wasn't a grand plan, no simmering plot hatched in secret. It was more like tripping, stumbling over a crack in the sidewalk you never noticed was there until you were already falling. For me, that crack appeared during my volunteer work at the MFA. We were preparing for a new exhibit opening, a stressful but usually rewarding time. I'd spent weeks researching a particular artist, delving into their work, feeling a flicker of that old intellectual spark I hadn't felt since college, probably. During a planning meeting, I presented some of my findings, ideas I was genuinely passionate about, and afterwards, someone came up to me. Let's call him Michael. Not part of the usual committee crowd, perhaps, affiliated with the visiting curators team. He wasn't just polite, he was engaged. He asked questions, real questions, that showed he'd actually listened, that he valued my perspective. He commented on an observation I'd made, calling it insightful. Insightful. When was the last time David had called anything I said insightful? Our conversations revolved around leaky faucets and Joshua's car insurance. This felt different. Like a spotlight turning on in a dimly lit room, illuminating a part of me I'd thought was packed away in storage. It led to coffee. Just coffee. In the museum cafe, sunlight streaming through the vast windows overlooking the Fenway. We talked about art, about Boston, about the feeling of being slightly adrift in midlife, something he admitted to feeling too, despite a seemingly successful career. He listened. He laughed at my admittedly dry, slightly dark observations about the social rituals of suburban life, humor David usually just blinked at. There was an ease, a connection, that felt both thrilling and deeply unsettling. I told myself it was harmless. Networking, professional camaraderie, a little boost for a flagging ego, perfectly acceptable. But a tiny voice, the one that had been whispering about those hairline cracks, knew better. It knew the jolt of anticipation I felt when his name popped up on my phone later that week, suggesting another meeting to discuss the exhibit further. It knew the extra care I took with my appearance that day, the flicker of something that wasn't just intellectual curiosity. The moment, when it happened, wasn't dramatic like in the movies. There were no swelling violins, no torrential downpours. It was a quiet transgression on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. Another coffee meeting had stretched into a shared plate of something forgettable at a small Italian place in the North End, the conversation flowing easily, touching on regrets and dreams deferred. There was a moment, walking back towards the tea station near Haymarket, the autumn air sharp and invigorating, where the conversation paused. A look was exchanged, a hand brushed mine, and the world tilted. All the carefully constructed walls of my life, Sarah Stephanie, dependable wife, devoted mother, respected community member, seemed to dissolve in that instant. It wasn't a conscious decision fueled by anger or revenge against David. It was a surrender. A surrender to feeling seen, desired, alive, even if just for a fleeting, illicit moment. It was a colossal, catastrophic error born from that deep well of loneliness and yearning I hadn't known how to address, how to even acknowledge before that point. The immediate aftermath wasn't relief or satisfaction. It was disorientation. Like stepping off a spinning ride, the ground unsteady beneath my feet. Guilt crashed down, cold and heavy. What had I done? This wasn't me. This wasn't the life I knew, the person I thought I was. Yet, Layered beneath the guilt was a confusing tremor of exhilaration, a dangerous flicker of having stepped outside, the lines of having acted on an impulse instead of measured consideration. Getting back on the green line, heading towards the quiet predictability of Newton, felt like re-entering a familiar play, but knowing I'd irrevocably changed the script backstage. The familiar brickwork of the Copley station, the rumble of the train, the faces of other commuters, everything seemed both intensely familiar and utterly alien. I felt marked, somehow visible, convinced that everyone could see the seismic shift that had occurred within me. That evening, and in the days that followed, anxiety became my constant companion, a cold knot permanently lodged in my stomach. Every ring of the phone made me jump. Every email notification sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Was it him? Was it someone who knew? Was it David? My interactions with David became excruciatingly strained, at least on my end. I scrutinized his every word, his every look. Was he suspicious? Did he notice my jumpiness, my forced smiles, the way I couldn't quite meet his eye? He seemed oblivious, wrapped up in a demanding project at work, complaining about Cambridge traffic, asking if I'd remembered to schedule the furnace maintenance. His very normalcy felt like an accusation. How could he be so calm when my internal world was a raging storm? Sleeping became difficult. I'd lie awake for hours, replaying the afternoon, dissecting my motives, drowning in what-ifs. What if someone saw us? What if Michael wasn't discreet? What if this single reckless act detonated the life I knew? The beautiful house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where I had to perform the role of contented wife flawlessly, despite forgetting all my lines and knowing, with sickening certainty, that the curtain could come crashing down at any second. The secret felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe the crisp autumn air that had felt so invigorating just hours before. The cracks weren't hairline anymore. They were starting to splinter. And I was terrified. You know, it's almost darkly humorous the way life plays out sometimes. You spend weeks, months maybe, living in a state of high alert, heart leaping into your throat at every unexpected noise, convinced discovery lurks around every corner, imagining dramatic showdowns worthy of a Hollywood film. And then, it happens. Not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a tablet screen turning on. Mundane, almost insultingly ordinary. That's how my meticulously constructed world, the one I was desperately trying to hold together with sheer will and frantic, invisible repairs, finally imploded. It was a Thursday evening. David had gotten home from Cambridge slightly earlier than usual, complaining about a canceled seminar. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in planning the menu for a charity dinner party we were supposed to host the following week, an event that now seems like something from another lifetime entirely. The air felt thick with unspoken things, as it often did then, but it was a familiar thickness, one I had learned to navigate. I thought I was safe, just another normal evening unfolding in our quiet corner of Newton. David came into the kitchen, looking for the shared iPad. He wanted to check, he said, if I'd put his upcoming dental appointment on the family calendar. Simple, domestic, utterly unremarkable. He picked it up from the granite island where I'd left it charging, its screen dark. He pressed the home button. And there it was. Not buried deep in some hidden file, not encrypted or cleverly disguised. Just there. A notification banner, stark against my serene background photo of the Arnold Arboretum in bloom. A message preview. From Michael. Containing just enough words. Something about last Tuesday. A reference to a shared joke. To be utterly damning. Innocent. Enough, perhaps, if you didn't know. But we both knew. Or rather, he was about to know. Time seemed to warp. Slow down. Stretch thin. I saw the moment his eyes registered the name. Saw the flicker of confusion, then the dawning, sickening comprehension flood his features. He didn't yell. Not immediately. David rarely yells. His anger tends to be a colder, quieter, more devastating force. He just froze. His knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the iPad. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin taut, almost translucent under the harsh kitchen lights. He lifted his eyes from the screen to meet mine, and the look in them. It wasn't just anger. It was deeper than that. It was a profound, shattering sense of betrayal, like he was looking at a stranger, someone he'd never truly known, standing, there in my place by the stainless steel sink. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, a noise I'd never consciously noticed before but which suddenly felt deafening, marking time in a world that had just stopped making sense. "Sarah Stephanie?" His voice, when it finally came, was unnaturally calm. Low, almost a whisper. But it carried more weight than any shout could have. "What is this? Who is Michael?" My mind raced, a frantic scramble for explanations, excuses, anything. Deny it? Impossible. Lie? Pointless. The evidence was right there, glowing on the screen between us. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My mouth went dry. Words failed me. All the carefully rehearsed apologies, the half-formed justifications I'd played out in my head during sleepless nights, vanished. All that remained was the stark, ugly truth and the devastating consequences staring back at me from my husband's wounded eyes. I think I might have shaken my head, a tiny, involuntary movement. Maybe I whispered his name. I honestly don't remember. It's a blur of pure, unadulterated panic. Cold dread washed over me, stealing my breath, rooting me to the spot. He didn't need my answer, really. He slowly placed the iPad back on the counter, his movements deliberate, precise. He looked around the kitchen, at the copper pots hanging above the stove, the neatly stacked cookbooks, the bowl of perfect lemons on the counter, as if seeing it all for the first time, or perhaps the last, like surveying the wreckage of something precious. Then he looked back at me, and the coldness in his eyes intensified, hardening into something that looked terrifyingly like contempt. "All this time," he said, his voice still quiet but laced with a bitterness that cut deeper than any accusation. "Our life, Joshua, 28 years. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The unspoken words hung in the air between us. Was it all a lie? He turned then, not waiting for a response I couldn't give, and walked out of the kitchen. His footsteps were heavy on the polished hardwood floor of the hallway. I heard the front door open, then close with a soft, final click that echoed the shattering of my world. And I was left standing alone in the heart of my beautiful, perfect home, the silence no longer quiet, but screaming. The accusation wasn't just in his eyes anymore. It was in the very air I breathed. The carefully constructed facade hadn't just cracked, it had been blown apart. And the real storm, I knew with chilling certainty, was only just beginning. David didn't come back that night, or the next. The click of the front door closing echoed in the sudden cavernous silence of the house, a silence that felt heavier, more accusatory than any words could have been. Did he go to a hotel? Stay at the small apartment the university kept for visiting faculty near Kendall Square? Drive aimlessly down the Mass Pike? I had no idea. My frantic calls went straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring tightening the knot of panic in my chest. The first 24 hours passed in a surreal haze. I wandered through the rooms of our beautiful Newton home, rooms filled with memories that now felt tainted, like photographs bleached by a harsh chemical. Every object seemed to accuse me, the wedding photos on the mantelpiece, the armchair where David always read the Sunday Globe, the empty space at the dinner table. I barely slept. When I did, fractured dreams of falling and judgment jolted me awake, my heart pounding. The hardest part, the task that filled me with a dread so profound it felt like physical illness, was telling Joshua. How do you tell your accomplished, principled son that his mother, the woman who taught him about honesty and integrity, has shattered the very foundations of the family he trusted? There's no easy way. No right way. I finally forced myself to call him, my hand trembling so much I could barely dial. Hearing his cheerful, unsuspecting, "Hey, Mom," almost broke me. I stumbled through the words, the confession catching in my throat like shards of glass. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. A silence so heavy it felt like I could hear the earth shifting beneath my feet. Then, his voice, when it came, was unrecognizable. Flat. Devoid of warmth. Filled with a stunned disbelief. That quickly curdled into something sharper. Disappointment. Hurt. Anger wasn't the primary reaction, not yet anyway. It was the crushing weight of disillusionment. "Mom, why?" he asked, the simple question carrying the weight of our entire shared history. I had no answer that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse. He didn't press. He just said he needed time, that he couldn't talk right now. And the line went dead, leaving me with another silence, this one somehow colder, more final than David's. Then came the slow, insidious creep of social fallout. It started subtly, as things often do in communities like ours, where appearances are paramount and direct confrontation is often avoided. I ran into Carol, my supposed close friend, at Roche Bros in Wellesley, while picking up groceries I had no appetite for. Normally, we'd chat for ages, catching up by the artisanal cheese display. This time, her eyes widened almost imperceptibly when she saw me. Her smile became fixed, brittle. The usual warmth vanished, replaced by a hurried, clipped exchange about the unseasonably warm weather. She suddenly remembered she was late for a yoga class she'd never mentioned before and practically fled down the aisle. It was a master class in polite dismissal, Boston style. Later that week, at a previously scheduled book club meeting held at another friend's house, an event I attended out of a desperate, misguided need for normalcy, the chill was palpable. Conversations would pause when I approached. People avoided direct eye contact. Questions about David were met with vague murmurs and swift changes of subject. I felt like a pariah, marked by an invisible scarlet letter, navigating a social landscape that had suddenly become hostile territory. The warmth and camaraderie I had taken for granted, perhaps even found tedious at times, now felt like a vital necessity I had carelessly thrown away. The whispers weren't always imaginary. Sometimes I'd catch snippets, see heads turn as I walked down Newbury Street, feel the weight of collective disapproval settling upon me like a shroud. It all culminated one bleak afternoon. I couldn't stand the suffocating atmosphere of the house, the constant reminders of my failure. I just got in the car and drove, aimlessly navigating the winding roads south of the city, eventually finding myself parked at an overlook in the Blue Hills Reservation. The view should have been stunning. The sweep of the autumn foliage, the distant Boston skyline hazy on the horizon. But all I felt was empty. Utterly, devastatingly empty. This was it, the bottom. The life I knew was gone, or irrevocably broken. My marriage, likely over. My relationship with my son, fractured perhaps beyond repair. My social standing, ruined. The respect I had commanded, evaporated. And for what? A fleeting moment of feeling alive? A rebellion against a quiet dissatisfaction I hadn't had the courage to confront honestly? The irony wasn't lost on me. I had yearned for something more, felt trapped in my perfect life, and in one reckless act, I hadn't found freedom. I had simply exchanged one cage for another, this one built of shame, regret, and isolation. Sitting there, with the wind whipping around the car, the vast, indifferent landscape stretching out before me, I was forced to confront the wreckage. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. Just the cold, hard reality of my choices and the devastating consequences rippling outwards, touching everyone I loved. The loneliness I'd felt before was a pale imitation of the profound desolation that washed over me then. It was the stark, terrifying loneliness of knowing you have no one to blame but yourself. Sitting there in the car, overlooking the vast, indifferent landscape stretching towards Boston, something finally shifted. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, no lightning bolt of clarity. It was more like the slow turning of a heavy tide. The frantic energy of panic and the crushing weight of despair began to recede, just slightly, replaced by something else. A bone-deep weariness, and beneath that, the first faint stirrings of accountability. Wallowing in the wreckage wasn't going to change anything. Blaming the world, blaming David's perceived lack of attention, blaming the quiet desperation of suburban life, none of it undid what I had done. The responsibility was mine alone. The affair wasn't something that happened to me. It was a choice I made. A disastrous, selfish choice with devastating consequences that I now had to face, head on, however painful that might be. The loneliness I felt then was still profound, but it morphed from the loneliness of victimhood into the stark loneliness of culpability. It was, in a strange way, a more solid ground to stand on, however rocky. Driving back to Newton that evening, the house didn't feel like an accusation anymore. It felt like a responsibility. A place full of broken things that I had broken. The first step, I knew, had to be internal. The next morning, my hands still shaking slightly, I sat down at my laptop, the same device that had held evidence of my betrayal, and started researching therapists. Specifically, therapists who dealt with infidelity, marital crisis, midlife issues. Making that first call, leaving a quiet, hesitant message on a confidential voicemail, felt like cracking open a door I had kept bolted shut for years. It wasn't absolution, not even close. But it was movement. A conscious step away from the paralysis of regret and towards the difficult work of understanding why. Why had I felt so lost? Why did I choose such a destructive path? What did I need to change within myself, regardless of what happened with David or anyone else? Reaching out to David felt even more daunting. He was still gone, staying somewhere. I tried calling again, left a brief, tearful message, not begging, not making excuses, just saying I understood his anger, his pain, and that I was deeply, profoundly sorry for betraying his trust and shattering our life together. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew it wasn't mine to ask for yet, maybe ever. I just needed him to hear the remorse, raw and unvarnished. Later, I wrote a letter, pouring out more of the same, acknowledging the depth of my mistake, taking full responsibility. I left it on his desk in the study, unsure if or when he would even see it. With Joshua, it was harder still. I sent him a text, keeping it simple, telling him I loved him, that I knew I had deeply disappointed him, and that I hoped someday we could talk properly, but that I understood he needed space. His reply, when it came hours later, was just 2 words, "Okay, Mom." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't warmth, but it wasn't silence either. A fragile, tentative thread in a tapestry I had ripped apart. So where does that leave things now? Months have passed since that awful discovery. The initial storm has subsided, replaced by an uneasy, fragile truce. David eventually came back to the house. Not to reconcile, not yet anyway, maybe not ever, but to live. We coexist in this beautiful, broken home like polite, wounded ghosts. The silence isn't screaming anymore, but it's heavy, laden with unspoken grief and uncertainty. Sometimes we manage brief, functional conversations. Sometimes the pain is too raw, and we retreat to separate corners of the house that suddenly feels both too big and too small. He hasn't mentioned the letter, he hasn't suggested divorce, but he hasn't suggested reconciliation either. We are in limbo. Joshua and I text occasionally. He asks about practical things, tells me briefly about work, the deep conversations, the easy laughter. That's gone, replaced by a careful, guarded politeness. I see the hurt still lingering in his eyes when we occasionally meet for a quick, strained coffee. My social circle has shrunk considerably. Carol and I exchange polite nods if we see each other. The invitations have dried up. I spend a lot of time alone, which ironically forces me to confront the very emptiness I was trying to escape. Therapy is hard, uncomfortable, necessary. It's forcing me to look at myself, my marriage, my choices with an honesty I've avoided for decades. Do I understand why I felt that initial dissatisfaction? Better, yes. I see the patterns of neglecting my own needs, of seeking external validation, of avoiding difficult conversations with David about the slow fade we were both experiencing. Does that excuse what I did? Absolutely not. Nothing can excuse the betrayal, the pain I inflicted on the people I love most. The lesson, learned in the most brutal way possible, is that addressing unhappiness requires courage, communication, and hard work, not secrecy and self-destruction. I destroyed trust that took nearly 30 years to build, and I understand, truly understand, that it may never be fully restored. My focus now isn't on fixing everything back to the way it was, because that's impossible. The old picture is gone forever. My focus is on rebuilding myself, on learning to live with the consequences of my actions, on trying to be a person worthy of forgiveness, even if it never comes. It's a quiet, solitary, ongoing process. There's no neat bow, no happy ending yet in sight. Just the daily work of living with regret and trying, slowly, painstakingly, to chart a path forward from the wreckage. It's a heavy burden to carry, knowing you caused so much pain, knowing you fractured the lives of the people you cherish, most because of a moment of profound weakness and selfishness. So I have to ask you, putting yourself in my shoes, or perhaps in David's, or even Joshua's, what would you have done? Can trust like that ever truly be rebuilt after such a deep betrayal? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear different perspectives. And if you connected with this story, if you appreciate explorations of complex human emotions and difficult choices, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future stories. Thank you for listening.